Okay, so I'm going to start talking about Indigenous America and eventually Spanish colonial, but right now I'm just going to start with an overview. So, Indigenous America basically includes North America, Mesoamerica, which is like the middle area, and South America. So, we're not going to look at every single culture, but we are going to look at a few key ones, especially, well, mainly the ones that are connected to the 250, to be honest. I might talk briefly about others, but I'm really going to just focus on the ones that are on 250. So Indigenous America, basically these are the people who actually originally migrated from Asia into America using the, hopefully I can write this quickly, using the Bering Strait. Okay, now the Bering Strait, if you can remember from, whoops, that's not connecting very well. Using the Bering Strait about 30,000 years ago, somewhat, 30,000, something along those range of time. Using the Bering Strait, basically it's like an ice path, okay, that it connects Asia or like Russia and that area of the continent, like all of that connects it to America. Now those from Asian descent had then taken a journey over and through the Bering Strait and settled in different various parts of America. They were nomadic, so they traveled quite a bit, and then they stopped and settled in different areas. Now, because they all eventually at some point all connect together, there are some similarities throughout the different cultures, but they also developed very independently from each other, so there are things that are very different. Now, just because you're European doesn't mean, the Germans are the same as the Swiss, or the Germans are the same as the French. Yes, they're all European, and yes, there's been a lot of mixing of cultures, but they are all each very distinct from the other. If I went to Germany, I called them all French, they'd think I was the crazy one. So when we're talking about Indigenous Americas, we have to be conscientious of which particular culture we're talking about. Even just doing some of the research and kind of brushing up on things, I noticed a lot of misguidings and false facts, because they're not facts, right? They're just lies or wrong. And that was kind of disappointing because you'd think we know better. Now, some of these civilizations cultivated a strong technical advancement in various ways and refined things like metal ore. Metal is found in the ground, and it's usually dirty because it's mixed with other things. So they found a way to refine the metal and to be able to use it in different ways. They were, most of them, very skilled in astronomy, some more than others, but overall all of them. Also different forms of literature, especially when we're looking at the Mayan civilization, a lot of writing. Even the Aztecs wrote, not only documentation, but poetry, songs, all kinds of things, and wrote them, like literature. Many start off as hunter-gatherers. When they do eventually settle in civilizations, they still use a lot of those skills to help feed one another. They develop their agriculture, etc. Many civilizations were built literally on top of other civilizations. Some civilizations were buried or destroyed, and the newer civilization would then build on top of it as a form of respect, as a form of absorbing the power and the energy of the people that were lost before. Okay? Archaeologists, in order to learn, had to dig. They had to dig, and every time they dig deeper and deeper and deeper, they found an older and older and older civilization. So that's how we know that happened. Art was very functional to many of these cultures, functional and aesthetic. So yes, it had to have a form of beauty or that was beautiful to them, but it also had to have function for their society, whether that's political, social, religious, or utilitarian function. It had to have function. The more functions, the better. If it was utilitarian, like it was a blanket, but it was also social, discussed social hierarchy, so like the patterns were significant to know that that being was of this rank in society. If it also had spiritual imagery on it that imbued that person with spiritual power, then even better. So layering the functions made that object or that art piece more important or better. What else? We also look at ancient Indigenous Americans across the whole span, but we do divide them into many different historical cultural groupings, and that's true of North America, Mesoamerica, South America. Each of them have their own, which I already discussed. Okay, often there are animal motifs, or there's a lot of animal imagery characteristics. For most of Indigenous America, animals were more powerful than humans were. Okay, humans were not the center of life. Animals could do things we couldn't do. They could run really faster, much faster than us. They are stronger than us. They can fly. They can see at night. They can do things that our bodies physically were inept to do. Humans were not the center of life. They were kind of more like a puzzle piece in the the giant puzzle that is all of the universe, and we're a small portion. Now, that belief was also mirrored by early European settlers, by African civilizations, Pacific Island civilizations, most indigenous people of Asia. So this isn't completely uncommon. Like, this is how most indigenous people's belief systems were built. They had shamanistic rituals, so I'm going to write that word, shamanistic. So in other words, shaman. So they had these shamans, or spiritual, I guess they're like priests, and they performed rituals. They had visions and prophecies. Those were very, very important to them, and they existed in a fully animated universe. And I don't mean cartoon animation. I mean that objects, elements were all beings of some sort. They had their own power, their own spiritual energy, their own soul, so to speak. Not literally, because I mean that just depends on what culture we're looking at. So yeah, so they had all of those beliefs, like the spirit and things like that. Artists often worked in workshops, so they work with a group of artists to create something. So it's very uncommon for us to find like a signature of one artist. It was pretty much a group of artists working together for the greater good or for the shared vision. Architectural structures were mostly made of stone, those that were built in large size and scale. A lot of pyramids. We see a lot of pyramids. We see a huge astronomical influence, and I mean astronomy influence. We have calendars, ritual objects, rituals in general that are connected to specific dates, times, and etc. Alignments, all that good stuff. Okay, so let's look at some things. First, we're going to talk about Mesoamerica. So it's kind of important that we focus on that, and then we move on to another region, because there are similarities here and there's differences, and then we're going to jump to another area with its own set of stuff. So Mesoamerica, we've got the Olmecs that are the oldest of the cultures that we're going to look at, often called the mother culture. And the reason why we call it the mother culture is because they influence the other cultures. So Olmec heartland is kind of in the curve, the innermost curve of the Gulf of Mexico there at the base. The Mayan are here in the green, and they are in the Yucatan Peninsula, so part of Mexico. Now, it looks like, from this picture, it looks like all of Mexico, but it's not. It trickles into other countries. So Mexico stops right here. Whoops, right there. Then we have Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, and eventually, of course, Nicaragua and Costa Rica. But Mexico has a higher concentration of Aztecs. So we've got the Mayans and the Yucatan, and they do spread out from there. And the Aztecs really centering in the Valley of Mexico, Lake Texcoco, Tenochtitlan, and then they kind of fill outward from there, and they spill out to the rest of this region. Now, if you look at the map to the right, these are our main archaeological sites, and you can see the Aztecs do, in fact, spread out. There's our Olmecs there. There's the Mayan and many of their specific things, locations that were significant that we can still see. Now, there's so much in that region that we don't know about, because a lot of that area is still like rainforest. So I think even just recently, in the last 2 years, we found another temple pyramid that we had no idea existed, because it was completely covered up by vines, trees, land. It was just gone. It was just reabsorbed, which is kind of exciting. Okay, so remember these from prehistoric unit in the very beginning of the year. So the camelid sacrum, camelid was from the family of like camels, basically. Camelids are like camels, llamas, alpacas, all that good stuff. So this was found in central Mexico. So we're about to go and look at this area. So we know that it was developed, created, sculpted by migrating humans, again, coming from the Bering Strait, 1,000 miles wide just about during the time that it was frozen over. So it was like not just people came, but animals came, all kinds of stuff. Like anything that could walk, basically. Many were going that direction. The image on the right was the Taltirco figure, female figure, and we know it's connected to some kind of level of shamanistic behavior. We had two heads, this concept of duality, 2 is 1, 1 is 2. Often we would see this concept of multiplication or duality in visions and in prophecies. So one of the first things that happens when a person starts to hallucinate is a few things. This is just psychological. This is what happens neurologically to all of us. When we have a level of hallucination, sorry, I can't say that word, hallucination, we start seeing multiples. So somebody's talking to us and we start seeing them have multiple mouths all of a sudden. We can see the sound of their voice, which is crazy. You can look in someone's eyes and it looks like their eyes are multiplying. So multiplication is common in visions. There's also this idea of rivalry of form, like these two halves fighting over the face, but they do share one eye, as in sharing a vision. So we can get all crazy psychedelic, but then it comes back to this like connection, like it actually makes some sort of sense to their belief system. We see big thighs, which were considered fertile and beautiful, fancy hair, which is beautiful, their ears have the gauges in them. As they got older, those gauges got bigger, so it was a way of showing their maturity. Fertility, those big thighs, were a part of woman's power, and that stays true to most of the region in Mexico, that women's power comes from creation, the ability to create another body or another being. Yeah, so let's move on. Origins of life. Okay, so this is mainly Mesoamerica, or origin of life. So what I'm about to say does not apply to the Native Americans, like, you know, the Apache or any of those cultures in our own United States indigenous regions. This applies to Mesoamerica, most of Mesoamerica. So, I'll jump ahead for a second. We've got the Olmec, which are the first ones to come on the scene, and you can see their dates here. This date kind of varies depending on who you ask, but this one's always the same. The Mayan are the next. This date is considered questionable as well. It changes. But this is when they finally end their civilization, like any form of the old civilization. This is when they're ultimately conquered by the Spaniards. Like finally, like definitively done. The classical period is during like the height of the Mayan civilization, which is like for us, if we think of ancient Greece, the classical period of ancient Greece was the height of their cultural understanding, right? Their peak of ability. And that happens from 250 to 950. The Aztecs show up at the very end, basically. They overlap the Mayans. Notice they all overlap each other a little bit. But they pretty much end in 1521. Now, it doesn't mean there's no Mayans ever. That doesn't mean there's no Aztecs ever. Well, these guys pretty much got diluted with Spaniard blood, but there are probably some that have more than others. But there are still Mayan people that are Mayan. They're not Mayan Spanish, they're Mayan. The Olmec were, again, considered the mother culture, but they trickled down. So some of the culture from the Olmec get into the Mayan and the Aztec. Some of the culture from the Mayan get into the Aztec as well. Because remember, they show up kind of later, so they're influenced by all of the civilizations before them. Okay, so let's go back to our origin. Uh-oh, what happened? Okay. This is acting weird. All right, let's go back. Okay, so origins of life. So in the beginning. All right, so in the beginning, the gods of the Mesoamerica region were trying to make human beings, and they wanted to make human beings. I hear different stories. Part of it was so that they had someone to worship them. Another one was so that they could help take care of the animals and the plant life. I heard another one where they were bored and they were making. So it kind of depends. I haven't found one that seems the most reliable, but all of the stories share this. Gods were trying to make man, and they were using maize. Now, most of us already know what maize is. Maize is corn. Now, it's not the typical corn that we think of today, that, juicy, sweet, yellow corn. Maize was all kinds of varieties of corn. Different colors, sizes, like there's a huge variety of maize. Now, they take maize and they would form man. They would make his body. But he would constantly die. And they couldn't sustain him for very long. So what they realized, the gods realized, is that they have to kind of sacrifice a piece of themselves to give life to these humans, these forms. So one of them decides to give some of their own blood. So it's like they cut themselves and they bleed, and they use that blood to help form the maize that they've grounded up. Some stories say that they took bones from animals and ground them up as well. So they ground up the maize or the bones and mix it. But all the stories have the maize. Take the maize, they mix the blood into the maize, and then they form the human being, and the human being lives. Now, because the gods gave of their own blood, they were weakened because they lost blood. Anybody that loses blood is weak. You shoot an animal, you don't kill it, but it's bleeding like crazy. Guess what? It's going to die from blood loss. Like, you get weak and you can die. So the gods needed to be replenished. So how do they replenish this? How do the Olmecs, the Mayans, the Aztecs, how do they replenish the blood of their gods? Well, they have to give their own blood or give up a human sacrifice for blood. They have to pay back that blood. Now, for us, maybe it seems barbaric or ridiculous, but to them it made perfect sense. 2 minus 1 isn't 2 anymore. It's 1. So you got to plus that 1 to equal 2 again. So you take something away, you got to give it back for it to be whole. So that's the origin of all their life. So we're going to hear and see how that story reconnects over and over again, because it is, important to their origins of their own life, the life of humanity. Okay, so coming back to this, we've already kind of talked about all this. The Olmec, one thing to say about them is they develop a way to harness rubber from the trees. And they actually take that rubber, they compact it, and they create ball, right? They come up with games, sports, and in fact, those games become very important and sacred in the Mayan community because there is a story of a set of twins that were able to outwit gods from the underworld, so that basically they make a bet and they're like, hey, if we win this, blah blah blah. So pretty good story, I suppose. And so they take that sport, that ball event, and they create a sacred ball game. Okay, if you've seen I can't think of the name of that movie. It was an animation, El Dorado. They played that ball game. Remember, it's a much easier version, actually. The one that you see on the movies than what was actually they had to do. It was insane. Anyway, so the Aztec, again, they absorb some of that, which I already talked about. Maybe we should just get into it. Yeah, let's just get into it some more. Oops, next one. Okay, well, we've kind of looked at maps already. This is like present day Mexico. There's San Antonio. If we go straight down and a little to the left, that's Mexico City. If we went all the way to Mobile, Alabama, and went straight down, then we'd be hitting the Yucatan. So you can see, in reference to us, it's fairly far. There's a Tropic of Cancer. The equator's down here somewhere. So I think it's maybe a little bit lower, but it's pretty close to the equator. My family, my mom's family, She's from there, right there on the other side of Sierra Madre. Okay, near Tampico. All right, so yeah, the names and stuff that you see over here, most of the names are names that are connected to the original cultures there. Okay, we talked briefly about time, that they had a really advanced understanding of time, and whew, this is a lot to talk about right here. So they understood time, you know, in a different sense than we do. Like our decades are every 10 years, right? That seems kind of arbitrary. We just picked a number, 10. You know, our centuries are every 100 years. You know, we've decided that, and we follow that decision all the way through. Other cultures develop their own systems of time. So this is a system of time that we know most through the Mayan civilization, but the Aztecs also agreed to this. They kind of had the same sense of time as well. The Mayan were a lot more specific than the Aztecs that we can see. Aztecs were still specific, but the Mayan were like super, super specific. So we have different types of calendars. The way they looked at time was very cyclical. So time would just turn over again. So, I mean, think about today, we look at a watch, it goes every 12 hours, right? And then we start over. So we go 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. and then we switch over, you know, to the other side. So it's like 12 a.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. We go all the way to 12 p.m. and then we start on the p.m.s. 1 p.m., 2 p.m. So for them, it was kind of in that sense, it would start over. So they had different calendars. We've got the 13-day calendar, and that, in fact, let me just show you this. They kind of describe them a little bit like, whoa, not what I was trying to do. Sorry. All right, there we go. Okay, so the way they describe it is kind of like this. They're like gears, and the gears fit into one another. And you can narrow it down to a smaller increment, and you can expand it out to larger increments. So we have 13 days. Those 13 days fit into 20 days. Those 20 days fit into 260 days. And the 260-day calendar is also based on several things. So the base of 20 and 13 are important numbers for the Mayans. So these two numbers are important for the Mayan civilization. The 120 days are approximately the length of a human gestation, in other words, human pregnancy. So from the day of conception to the day of birth is just about 9 months. That's 260 days. So that increment is really important for them. It also aligns to the moon. New moon, harvest moon, all those things line up to a 260-day cycle as well. So not only does it align with the human pregnancy, but it also aligns to astrological, geographic, and archaeological significance. Originally the Olmecs, but also this is also absorbed into the Mayan civilization. It also lines up to the approximate plat to harvest cycle for crops. So again, like 260 it keeps coming up to a significant number. So they create a calendar, and again, it's kind of like a gear. That's 260 days. And sometimes they call that 260 the day rituals. So it's all about rituals. So that 260 day fits into all these other days. In fact, that's what I was trying to show you a second ago. This, let me grab the eraser, is a kind of interesting representation here of the different cycles. So you've got 13 in here in this inner gear, and then the 20 on the outer gear. And then that fits in again to the 260. So like whereas this shifts several times, these stay put, and so they all like click into each other differently. The smaller gear makes more turns, the larger gear turns less often. Okay, this is kind of hard to explain. Then we have the solar calendar, which is the 365-day calendar. I mean, if you think about us, we have, this doesn't sound that crazy, because we have 60 seconds in 1 minute. We have 60 minutes in 1 hour. We have 24 hours in 1 day. We have 365 days in 1 year. We have the same concept. It's just that they looked at it completely different. We've bought into this whole system. They had a different kind of way of dividing. Many of it is the same, many of it is different. This 365, we are connected to that. We believe in the 365 day, right? Yeah, that makes up a year. but it only makes up a solar year. That's one type of division of time for them. So in the 365, we have 20 days and 18 months. Now we divide our year into 12 months with about 30 to 31 days. They have 18 months, 20 days, plus these 5 days. Now, what do you think those extra days are lying around for? Guess. Well, every 4 years we have a leap year, and we get a couple of extra days in there. So that makes sense. Now, it is slightly skewed with time for the lack of count of a quarter day in a tropical year. So their year, because they're closer to the equator, is slightly different in their alignment to the sun. Okay, 52 Hobbs cycles. So like that would be kind of like how we have our own centuries at 100 years. That's kind of a different kind of turnover. We start a new century. Well, for the Mesoamerican cultures, we have a 52 Hobbs cycle that, you go around the whole calendar and then you start again at 0. So you get through it and you start over. Then after that, we have the solar years, which are the pictons. And those turn over every 7,885 solar years. So it's like taking these, and that many of those equal a brand new picton. It's like an era, a brand new era. All right, so so much to talk about. So when you heard all this talk about the end of the world was supposed to happen in like December 21st, 2012, all that crazy business, the Mayan calendar ends, blah, blah, blah. It only ends because it turns over to a new picton. Dummies. So for the Mayan, the way they aligned it, it ended December 21st, 2012, where for the Aztecs, it was supposed to end in 2007. So, that's just how they lined it up and when they started counting to when they stopped counting. When does the beginning of their 52 cycles begin? When is the end? Do you see what I'm saying? When do they start counting the solar years? When do they stop counting the solar years? If I started counting 7,885 on August 1st, it's going to be different for somebody else starting their solar year in January 2nd. It's just lining up differently, but the numbers are still the same. We're still counting to 7,885. We're just starting at different start times. Okay, so for the Mayan, the last large cycle started in August 11th, 3114 BCE, and it ended December 21st, 2012. Okay, so that's just one picton that they found. Okay, so much talking. All right, the 52 years, though, were really significant to the Aztecs. They did what's called a fire ceremony. So every 52 years was kind of like a century to them. Remember, cyclical time. So they started over with a new century, so to speak. During the fire ceremony, everybody in their civilization, or in that community specifically, that city, would break all of their utensils and snuff out all of their fires in their home. And then the priest would sacrifice a human and take their heart and some of their bones and make a new fire from those things. So they would make a fire, and from that fire, all of the rest of the community would come and take the fire for their homes and make new utensils and make new things, because it was the beginning of a new cycle, of the beginning of a new century for them. And so there's a renewal that happens. So very spiritually significant to them. Okay, I hope that made sense. So when I mean cyclical, I don't mean like they're restarting the same year. It just means they're starting back from 0 in a new slot, in a new era. So for us, we're starting a new set of 100 years, but we call it the 21st century instead of the 20th. So they didn't call it by numbers. They would say, the picton of the earth, picton of the moon, picton of the sky gods. Like it's their picton. Okay. Whew, that was a lot of talk. All right. Mesoamerican afterlife. So Mesoamerica believed in afterlife very, very similar to ancient Egyptians believed in afterlife. There was an underworld. So right here is the earth, and it's interesting because they have the sun on both sides. So here's where we live, right? They use this tree as a way to connect to the celestial, right? Now, And notice the route of the sun in the morning, the route of the sun in the afternoon. Here is high noon. And then the sun passes the Earth's line, the Earth's surface, and goes into the underworld. The route of the sun at night, the route of the sun at night, and boom, it's back to dawn. So this is again cyclical. All right. Now, Earth was just one part of the universe. The underworld was another part of the universe. The celestial was another part. Now, human beings were destined to live on the Earth's surface, and then they go down into the underworld. Now, their journey through the underworld was one of trial and tribulation, okay? But you didn't go straight to heaven. You didn't go straight to celestial. You hung out in the underworld, and you went through your journey and all of your trials before you were allowed to go into the celestial realm. Now, the time that you spend in the underworld just depended on your ability to get through it all. So, you might master one level very quickly, and then the next level is taking you a really long time. The next level, another really long time. The next level, really quickly. The next level, really long. Do you see what I'm saying? Every person's journey, depending on their strengths and weaknesses, would determine how long and if you would ever get out of the underworld. Okay? Now, the celestial world was one of order. It was where the gods lived. Not all the gods, there were some underworld gods. But it's where the gods lived. It's where everything is beautiful, harmonious, orderly, all that good stuff. In the underworld, it was dark and it was full of water, believe it or not. It was like a water world of darkness. There was no light. So it was considered an inversion of the celestial realm. So everything that would have been in the celestial realm is inverted in the underworld. So what was land is now water. What was water is now land. You know, all that stuff. Okay. So, talking so fast. The underworld was actually made up of 9 levels. So I'm going the wrong way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 levels. Okay. The celestial world is made up of 13. So I'm going all the way down. 13. So you can see that underworld is, even though it's a mirror inversion of the celestial world, it is still lacking in comparison to the celestial. Celestial is still always the best. There is no Book of the Dead like we had in ancient Egypt, at least not one that we know of for the Mayans. The Aztecs have they show some process of the underworld. They talk about obsidian winds, and obsidian is like a stone that's really dense and very sharp. Like if you break it, it breaks off in like shards, so it's almost like really durable glass. They would often use it for like arrowheads or other like daggers and weapons because it was very sharp and painful. So imagine wind filled with that. It would just cut you up. Each level that you conquered was a journey, which I already mentioned. For most of Mesoamerica, war was not just for killing. It wasn't for like, hey, I don't like you, you made me mad, I'm going to kill all your people. It's not like that. War was typically to capture the people of that area, of that city-state, for instance, and take them back home and either sacrifice them or take them back home and enslave them. Like there was a reason for the war. There wasn't just these random acts of violence. They were doing this violence for a reason. Okay? Okay, let's see. Oh, the Mayan. Okay, I'm going to stop here. The Mayan acted a lot like the independent city-states of ancient Greece. So we've got the political alliances that ancient Greece would have had. We have the rivalries that ancient Greece would have had. So we look at it as a large culture, the Mayan culture, but understanding that each city kind of had its own kind of self-identifying personality, so to speak. And so each of those cities may have had alliances where they empowered one another politically, but may have also had other relationships that could have resulted in some conflict. Their religious beliefs, though, would have been very, very similar, pretty much exact. They shared the same gods. The rituals would have been the same. So they come from a pantheistic religious set. So what we mean by pantheistic is that they were multiple gods, right? Many gods. That's what that, I need to find my pen. Yes, pen. Many, pan meaning many, theos meaning gods. They were also like the ancient Greece gods, is that we had natural forces in connection. So like Zeus had, thunder and lightning kind of thing. We had gods associated with the sun. So the Mayan actually have their own gods that also embody different aspects. So it might be the god of rain, for instance, who is Shak. His name's Shak. We'll look at him in a minute. So he is a god associated with that force. Now, they often would combine attributes as well, which was not that uncommon, especially like in ancient Egypt, where we had Ra, the sun god, and he would take on other aspects and then give them back away to other gods, and they would come back together again. So they also had that sort of setup in their belief system. Rituals were very important, very, very important, as you remember, to the origin of life, of humanity. They include this element of blood. And so you had priests who were acting as shaman, who would go into trances and talk about prophecies and visions, and they would perform different sacrifices, including blood sacrifices like bloodletting, which we'll look at, and human sacrifices, but only as necessary and only as needed for certain rituals. Oftentimes these human sacrifices, many people would say, oh, everybody was like proud to be a sacrifice, and they were like super thrilled to be killed. Yes and no. Like, there was an association of like respect for having that position to be sacrificed, but I don't know if it was necessarily like, oh, me next, okay, because it wasn't like fun. Okay, they were educated people. There were many portions of society that their only purpose was to document things. So they had an extensive and very complex language system, and in fact, the written language had been lost to us for many, 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 many years. Basically, once the Spaniards come in and conquer and do all that stuff and ruin everything for everybody. I say that, but I don't mean it completely. There was some good things they brought. So when they destroy the Mayan history, they don't allow them to read and write. They lost the ability to be able to read their own language. And their language isn't like ours today, where we have a letter that represents a sound. Like, that's not how it works. It's closer to like Chinese writing, where certain lettering or symbols represent like a place or a concept or an object, and then you can combine those together to create a brand new thing. So for instance, if this little symbol represents God and this represents a home, then you put the God in the home, and that's a temple. You see what I mean? So it was in that sense, and it's not a hieroglyph. So if you ever hear somebody say, oh, the hieroglyphs of the Mayans, no, don't use that word. That's the wrong word, because the hieroglyphs is different than what they use, and what they use is called logograms. They were complemented by a set of symbolic glyphs. So you would have these, like, they almost look like images, but those images are representative of a certain place or a time or a thing, and then you combine them with other things, and then you combine them with other things, and it creates a whole new word. So it can get very complex, and that was why it was so hard for us to understand and decipher it. Now, eventually, within the last 50 years, we've gotten a lot better at reading them. So, more and more greater understanding as we've gone into, 21st century. But for many, many years, we had no idea what it said. They even recorded in like books, and we called the books a codex. If you have many books, you call them codices. The books were like accordion style, so you'd have like a cover, front cover and a back cover, and the pages would actually, connect, and they would fold. So these would all fold in and out and in and out and in and out, and so you'd have the cover on top and then the back cover behind it. So it's almost like an accordion, and that's why we call it an accordion style, because you would open up the panels on the outer edges and open, and you could see lots of words on one side and images, and you flip it and you'd see more on the other. So they can condense a lot of information into a flattened piece, a couple of pieces of like boards and stuff. Okay, they did have paper. They used fig tree bark, and I think other kinds of barks as well to create pages and paper. Husks maybe too, I'm not quite sure on that, but I do know they used fig tree bark for sure, but I think they used other things too. Stone reliefs, so they recorded events on reliefs, and those reliefs would be presented usually on a structure. So we're going to see that in the images we look at for the 250. Complex understanding of astronomy, math, time. We talked a lot about time earlier with their calendar system. The Mayans are the ones that have the long count, and they really specify the 50-year cycles, and they talk about different, very specific things within that period. So they had a very complex understanding of time. Their knowledge of astronomy was better than what was going on everywhere else in the world. They understood it a lot better than Europe did at the time. Math, I think they're the ones that had the 0. I meant to check on that and I forgot to, but they understood like algebra. There was all kinds of stuff that they were using, so it was good. Wait, they might not have had algebra just yet, but they think they were developing something that was like algebra. Anyway, moving on. Okay, so a little bit more about mine before we start looking at the pieces. So these are some of the city-states. Notice they're in Mexico. We already kind of saw this. They're in Mexico, they're in Guatemala, they're in Belize, a little bit in Honduras. So we see them kind of scattered in this general area. Looking at the image at the top, you can see there's a lot of lush greenery around them. I mean, think about it. They're fairly close to the equator. They're along like the Tropic of Cancer or Capricorn. I don't know, whichever one is on top on the northern hemisphere. So they enjoy a lot of, rainfall and lots of good sun. So vegetation loves it. They're pretty much kind of areas near what we would consider a rainforest. So there was a lot of forest around them, which is great, but also maybe difficult to grow crops. So they had to learn to cultivate it in a way that would allow them to grow crops as well as enjoy the forest. Okay, so on the right here we see upper class. Of course, what we typically see, kings, priests, nobles. Middle class here is a lot bigger, which is good. There are commoners, professionals, officials, bureaucrats. So these are the people that would be documenting things all the time. We also have artisans who would work in connection to all of these, and merchants. But these are all middle class. So even at the hierarchy of the middle class, we see the artisans at the end, unfortunately. The lower class, though, the absolute lower class would have been the hard labor, servants, and of course slaves. And the slaves would often come from those rival city-states or other, people that they've conquered. They would use them as slaves. Or I think sometimes, criminals and things they would use that way. Okay, so here's an image of some of the deities. Now this isn't like an accurate depiction, because we have an accurate depiction. It's just like many things you've seen, like different artist rendering of what Zeus might look like, or Aphrodite. This is another artist rendering. I think it's from a game. I can't remember the name of the game yet right now. But we see some major gods depicted here. Shak, who I mentioned earlier, is right there. You might notice there's a lot of inclusion of like feathers or birds or snakes, serpents, jaguars. We see a lot of animalistic tendencies, because those animalistic tendencies, as we said earlier in like the intro, animals were more powerful than us humans. So when they're associating with their gods would have animal properties as well, and sometimes even looking just like animals, and having animal faces and traits and bodies that can be biomorphic, so they could change into an animal and into a being that looks more like a human, back and forth, because they were that powerful. So the Shak gods right here, the rain god. There are some that are listed in the images, and there are some that are not, so I've included the chart on the right for us to look at. Another one, I mean, you can look at it. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to keep going. But this god at the bottom, Kukulkan, is the Aztec Quetzalcoatl. So we'll look at him a little bit later. Oh wait, we might not look at him in the 250, but he's a shared god between the Aztecs and the Mayans. And that's true too, like a lot of the Mayan deities actually came from Olmec deities. The Aztec deities overlap some of the Olmec and the Mayan. So, there you go. They're very close together, so it makes sense. Same thing happened in Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. A lot of those different civilizations there shared some of the same gods. So it's not that weird. Okay, moving on. Oh, the twins are a pretty cool thing. There's the twins. Y'all look at that if you want. Moving on. Okay, this is on our 250. So Yaxchitlan is in Chiapas, Mexico, and what we're looking at is structure number 40 on the left and structure number 33 here in the center. Now, this structure is supposed to be standing in for structure 23. which is crumbled beyond ability to take a photo of, okay? So they use structure 33 as a stand-in for structure 23, okay? Now this on the right here is a relief that would have been found, it's a lintel relief, and it would have been like right above the doors. So it's a lintel relief that would have been right above the doors of structure 23. Specifically, it's from structure 23, but again, structure 23 does not exist anymore. Okay, so let's start talking about structure, about the land, and then we'll look at structure 40. So right here, Yaxchilán is right here on the bed of the Usumacinta River. Usumacinta River. And this is the river here, and this is the river here. And notice it almost looks a lot like an oxbow, where the river is winding around so much, and then it comes and creates almost like a curve, like a circular space. So because it's got the river all the way around it, you can imagine that this space is very fertile, which is great, but it also gives it religious significance because it's between these two hills. And Yaxchilán stands for, or translates to, split sky. The split sky space, or like two hills across a river is probably easier for us, but split sky is what they called it. And I think the image for it looks like something like this, and it's got a thing, and there's dots, like this, the symbol, the logogram for this town. It looks like split sky. Okay. One hill is on the inside bend, the other hill is on the outside bend. So this goes up and this goes up. So like in this picture here, the inside's going, the outside's going, and this follows the river all the way down. So this side is still going up. Okay, and then this side continues as you go down the river. And so if you look on the right here, here is Yaxchilán, and they have acropolises. We have the West Acropolis, the Central Acropolis, the South Acropolis. So these are all elevated spaces that are meant for like sacred use, and they're not common. Remember when we learned a lot about sacred spaces? One of the ways that we as human beings show something to be more important or closer to the gods and more significant of another world is by elevating it. So all of these acropolises are elevated to some extent. Now, notice this image on the right, the map that I have. You see these little lines. You may or may not have seen these before. Those are called topographical maps. Okay, topographical maps are trying to show you the elevation of the space. So like this one says, whoa, back it up. This one says 200 meters probably high. So this is higher than this. It's higher than down here, which is at 100. So you can see that this and structure 40 tell us that structure 40 was probably more significant than maybe the structures in the lower elevations, which is true. So keep that in mind. At the solstice, the summer solstice, the sun would actually go in between these hills, and you'd see like a clear cut through, and it would actually cut through Yaxchilán, which was cool for them because it gave them some significance to their location, which means it's like a holy place. So it created that Yaxchilán as a sacred site. So of course they want to build important sacred things there. The river, Usumacinta River, is kind of like a highway for this system over here. So all these different city-states along the border, this was a way to connect everybody. It was almost like a highway. You would take a trip on the thing and end up in a different city-state, maybe for trade, maybe for political alliances, etc. It's like an ambassador from the United States going to Great Britain. Okay, let's start going into the structures now. So we're going to look specifically at structure number 40 first. So structure 40, I love this image here because it shows the civilization wasn't just, let's just put it on the bank of a river. They created, an actual, looks more like an urban environment. Everything was clean and clear and founded with, stone, and it's developed and all of that. And you notice how some things are taller than others because they needed to elevate it closer to the heavens. So all this stuff makes sense when you look at it with that kind of context. So we can't think about it like this, we have to think about it like this, okay? So this particular structure, 40, is the one that was at a higher elevation, and that was made for King Shield Jaguar. Shield Jaguar. Also known as Itzam Naj Ba'alam II. So he was considered one of the first divine shaman of the kingship, of the nobility. That's kind of a name he gave himself, so to speak. Yeah. At the top here we see what's called a roof comb, and a roof comb was an structural ornamentation. It was like an extension to help elevate the building closer to the heavens, into the celestial realm. We also have corbels, and corbels are just like extensions, almost like a landing. This one's always bigger, right below the doorways, and if I go back one, you can see there's like corbel enough for this guy to stand. But yeah, so those are the corbels. So it's like a lentil stone that projects further out from the post and lintel. In this case, it's like the base. It's kind of like a step, I suppose. There was always more attention given to the exterior space than there was the interior. These interior rooms were fairly small because living where they were, they spent most of their time in the outdoors, very little time in the indoors. Also, this is a temple for Shield Jaguar, and what you can't tell from the picture is that the temples for most of Mayan society, and in fact even in Aztec society, I think they did this as well, Mayan civilization would actually build upon the last king's temple. So, for instance, if there was a temple built here for King so-and-so, then it would be buried and a new one would be built on top, and then that one would be buried and a new one would be built on top. So they would continually elevate. Now, they weren't covering it to, like, ignore that king or pretend that king didn't exist. No. They did it. They didn't destroy the temple. They would bury it. It was a way of preserving it. And they would build upon the king, almost like you would say, I'm building upon their legacy. Same idea. The king is building upon what was done before him. And so he's like taking the power and the spiritual goodness from this place, from this king, and embodying it in the next king, and in the next king, and the next king. It's like they're absorbing the power, absorbing the past, and absorbing that legacy into the new temple and the new king. So it was not a sign of disrespect to do that. It was a sign of respect. Wanting to say that I don't want to build on this is kind of a jerky thing to say, actually. Okay, so let's move on to structure 33. So I'm going to actually back up because I should have split this differently. So remember, this is structure 33, and it's a stand-in for structure 23. Now, structure 23 was for Lady Zoc. Lady, structure 23. Lady Zoc, or Shock, so it depends on who you ask. Lady Shock. The X usually is pronounced as an SH. Lady Shock. And so her temple, and I'm going to back up one more time, was down here. Remember, hers was 23, so it was right here, if you follow that line. We're looking at structure 33 because it's the closest in like, you know, understanding of what it was. So structure 23, so I'm going to pretend it's 23 that we're looking at. Lady Jacques was the royal queen of Shield Jaguar, okay? She was one of 3 of his wives. She was also known as Lady Kabal Shuk. She enjoyed a higher noble status than her husband, Shield Jaguar, and that may have been why he marries her. She was his aunt, so that's weird. But because of his ranking and her higher ranking, his marriage to her elevates his status, even though he was already king. But it brings his kingship to a higher status because of his marriage to her. Think about like rankings and stuff. Like, it's a really complicated system. I mean, not complicated, just you know, whatever. Anyway, so she's one of 3 wives. Now, she's the only wife that has a temple dedicated to her. In fact, she's one of very few women who are ever, throughout all of Mayan that we've found, Mayan civilization that has her own temple. She's one of very few. I can't remember how many there are, though. She never gives him an heir. So she was infertile, possibly infertile, unless they never consummated their marriage. But she was possibly infertile, and that also might have been a reason why he makes this temple for her, as kind of making it up to her, and also because she had a higher status than him, so she didn't have to marry him. You know, kind of keeping her happy, so to speak. He does have an heir with a different wife, Lady Evening Star. Yes, that was her name. But Lady Shock doesn't enjoy that. Now we're going to look at those lentils I talked to you about. Now this lentil right here is featuring Lady Shock right down here. And remember, these lentils would have been seen right above the doorway, just like this picture shows. So this young woman is walking and standing in the threshold and looking up, and she can see this this lentil. Now we number them because it's easier to talk about them like that. This is number 25, okay? But it's actually the first one that was carved out of the 3. So let's look at them. So this is lentil 25, first one to be made. Lentil 24 was actually the second one to be made, and it was made 28 years after lentil 25. I know this gets confusing, but we can get through it. Lentil 26 was third to be made, and it was made towards the end of Shield Jaguar's reign. So when we look at this, we see Lady Shock is featured in every single one of these. So it makes sense that she, you know, this is for her temple, because we should see her, right? And these are different events and prophecies and stuff that she takes place in, showing her significance in relationship to the king and the king's relationship to her. So it's reinforcing some of their roles in society and their political agenda, as well as their religious practices. We're going to see some of that too, because all that went hand in hand. There wasn't a separation. Excuse me, for them. Okay. Where was I? Okay, we aren't going to talk about this first. We can't, because I have to actually set it up for you for this one. And you think, well, why do we have to cover 24 if that was the second one to be made? Well, the reason why they made this middle one first is because it was the most important. If I back up to the center doorway was always the most important doorway. These were second to the center, right? So they're not as important to the central doorway, so it makes sense that this one was made first because it's the most important. But to tell the story, we actually do read it this way, okay? And since this one was made first, we kind of need to do this before we do this, all right? Okay, so we're going to get into what's happening in the lentil 24, and I'm showing the drawing because I think it'd be a little bit easier to break it up to be able to see, you know, what you can see. So in number 24, we see a bloodletting ritual. Bloodletting. Whoops. Letting. So bloodletting rituals were performed because, well, we know the blood significance, right? They're replenishing the lost blood of their gods. But it was also a way of showing self-sacrifice, showing the endurance of pain for the benefit of the gods, but also to the benefit of their people, because it was the royal class that was responsible for bloodletting. They weren't human sacrifices, but they were the ones that let of their own blood, their royal blood, for the gods. Okay, so bloodletting ritual, we were talking about. Whoops, sorry. Forward, pen. Okay, bloodletting. So, as you can see in the picture here, you see in her hands, Lady Shook is holding, it looks kind of like a rope. And on that rope there are these little like barbs. They almost look like thorns, but they're not thorns. They're actually pieces of obsidian. And I think I mentioned obsidian before in the origin stuff. Obsidian is this really dense rock. When you chip at it or you break on it, it creates really sharp shards or really sharp edges. So they often use it for like daggers and swords and things like that, or arrowheads, anything that they would use to pierce through something. It was very sharp. So these pieces are attached and woven into the rope, so as she pulls it, it's cutting her. And you might be thinking, what? What do you mean cutting her? How? Well, that rope is actually going through her tongue, if you can see right in there. she has a hole, so she has a hole in her tongue, and she's pulling the rope through that hole in her tongue. And as she pulls it, those shards are cutting up her tongue, and it's causing a lot of blood. You know, because there's certain areas of our body that if you get a cut, even if it's minor, it often bleeds profusely. Like, I mean, profusely, that might not be the actual word. A lot, okay? Your tongue, your mouth, for instance, bleeds. It usually heals quicker too because it has to. The genitalia area often has a lot of blood. The head has a lot of blood. You know, certain body parts that need and require a lot of blood to flow through it obviously bleed a lot when you cut it. So as she's bleeding through her tongue, it like rains down, kind of literally, down onto this, where the rope is actually resting on. And there's a basket, and in that basket there are these like pages. And you see those black spots on there? Those are supposed to be her blood droplets landing. And so in that basket we have fig tree bark, and as the blood drops on there, it's like soaking up in the paper, and it will actually be burnt up. Now, who we see right here is actually Shield Jaguar right above her, and notice how he's standing. He's wearing all his regalia. He's standing above Lady Shock, and Lady Shock is in obeisance, kind of kneeling down before him. And in his hand, in his hand here we see his torch. He's holding a torch with flames at the top. And that tells us something. That tells us that this ritual was actually taking place during the night. And so him holding that torch is lighting up this event so that you could see what's happening. He also, his headdress here, he's got feathers in it, and we're going to hear a little bit later on in the Aztecs the significance of certain feathers. But feathers, as well as the other animal patterns and pelts and skin, well, skins and pelts are the same thing, were all significant because they embodied power. And if you wore it, it gave you power as well. And on the top of his head there, you see a little shrunken head. That shrunken head, if you've never seen or heard of shrunken heads before, they would beat the face, like the bones in the face, and pull those bones out. And so what was left was very little tissue and skin. And they would let that shrink, get dehydrated, and then they would literally wear those until they rotted up and, you know, fell apart. So that's cool. So it was probably like symbolic of his enemies, or it could have been an enemy that he had killed. But he stands above her. Now, I'm not ignoring the fact that the position that they are both in is maybe a little suggestive. Her pinky is pointing towards his genitalia area. What we don't see in this shot is just before this, the king himself actually has a bloodletting ceremony where he has a hole that goes through his penis, and he pulls a very similar rope through his hole, and it releases a lot of blood. That event, as well as her and what she's doing right now, are both in association with a natural event that occurs with women once a month, every month. They have a menstruation cycle, and they bleed through their vaginal cavity, right? Okay, well, the king does that with his penis. That rope pulling bloodletting is also kind of in reference to bleeding from genitalia. It's just his. Now, why would they do that? We'll come back to that. Why is she doing it? We'll also come back to it. They're about the same reasons. But as she uses her mouth, the tongue, all of that, it's like an orifice that is similar to a female vaginal, you know, the genitalia orifice. Has lips, it's, encased, it's pink, it's red, it's all that stuff. So both of them are in reference to that event. Now, why would that be significant? A woman's menstrual cycle. Well, if a woman has a menstrual cycle, then she's able to have children. So by having that blood come from our bodies, it's getting our bodies ready for life. Now remember, way back at the origins, blood is life for them. They needed blood for their own life to be created. They also need that blood to give back to the gods for their life. But from a woman being able to menstruate, that blood is symbolic for her ability to have life. So it all connects. What happens during this blood ritual, bloodletting ritual. So if you've ever suffered from a lot of blood loss, a lot of things happen to your body. One of them is you start to kind of hallucinate. You get really, really weak physically, and your mind starts to do other things. And so when they would bloodlet, they would often have hallucinations or visions. Those visions were like good things for them. So if they were experiencing visions, then they would take that as prophecy. They would interpret those visions. They were a good thing for their shamanistic religion. Now, it was a royal obligation for both the king and the queen to bloodlet, because they were responsible for the rain. So when I talked about the blood raining down on this paper, the king would use that torch to then set fire to the paper, and that paper would burn up, right? You would have ashes, but you would also have smoke, and that smoke would find its way up into the heavens, right, and disperse. So the blood that she's letting onto the paper would then smoke its way up into the heavens, and then that blood would be given to the gods. Okay, that was the translation for them. That was the symbolic way of getting that, and literally giving it to the gods. The royal class was responsible for the rain, and so what god do you think was destined to have that blood? It was Shak, the rain god. It was a life-giving force. These royal individuals had to endure the pain for the good of the people, because because of rain, they needed that for their agriculture, and the agriculture sustains the entire society, including their people. So they needed to do that. They had to endure for all the right reasons. She kneels in obeisance, but he's also commanding her as well. So it's kind of an exchange. She's showing respect, but he's also reinforcing his position as well. It reads from left to right. It starts actually with the date, so I'm going to erase some of this so you can see it. But the date's actually here. Now you can see some of those logograms. So they look kind of cute, but they're not supposed to be cute. But I tend to look at them and go, oh, that's kind of cute. It's maybe because they're rounded. Maybe that's why we associate certain things like that. But they're very complex. So like certain things with lines and dots just change the entire meaning of it because you've included new things. So it's misleadingly simple, but it's actually very complex. Let's see, top to bottom. So this right here, this shape is read from left to right, and you go across and then you go down, and that's actually the date. And I did not write the date here, but I think it was like October or something. It gives you a very specific date. I just don't have those notes with me. Those were my old notes. Okay, let's move on to the next. Oops. Yeah. Whoops. No, sorry. So let's move on to the actual piece. So on the actual piece that we're looking at, and this is again the more important one, we are actually seeing, dang, where'd my note go? There it is. Okay, I just kind of had them a little out of order here. Okay, so this is lentil 25, and it was made in 681, and still trying to find it. I was on the wrong page. Oh, while you're looking at it, you may notice some things. They like thicker thighs. They like thick thighs. They like big noses. They also had almond-shaped heads. Meant to mention that when I was talking about shield jaguar, but you see how his head's kind of almondy shape. That was because they actually, as babies, they found the almond-shaped head to be beautiful. So as babies, they would put these boards, and they would wrap the boards on the baby's head so that as the baby's soft skull would start to harden, it would harden in the shape that they were basically sculpting it into. They would have that board there so that the head wouldn't grow in that direction, it would grow in a different direction. Their hair was done in these like top knots, and you can kind of see it a little bit here, mainly here you can see it, but they would have these knots, and those knots were mimicking corn silk. So if you looked at the tip of corns, you know, they have like the hair coming up. It's almost kind of like a ponytail looking thing. But they were mimicking that because that was beautiful to them, which makes sense. Yeah. The last one we looked at, by the way, would have been painted completely blue. This one most like, whoa, mama. This one most likely did the exact same thing. It was painted in what's called a Mayan blue, and Mayan blue was like an indigo dye that had like a shade of jade kind of into it. But blue, greens, all of those were very, very sacred to them, sacred colors, because they were associating with the sky, with rain. So they were important. They were significant. Now, in the center here, we're seeing her vision. The vision she experiences after her bloodletting ceremony. So that's why we had to look at lintel 24 first. So this is from her vision. You notice the basket. I gotta erase this again. Dang it, Vargas. Okay. So the basket, it's a different basket, but we see lots of papers coming out with lots of dots. Notice she's carrying another basket with more papers in it, full with dots. So she's had a lot of bloodletting, obviously. And what we're seeing is like out of it looks like it's coming out of the basket. We have this really kind of winding figure, right? It looks like a serpent. It is a serpent. You see these little scale looking things here? That's like the belly of the snake. We have two heads though. There's one head and there's the other head. It's difficult to see the heads. I know that it is, but I'm going to try to outline the open mouth here, and then these are the teeth. So it's opening this way. The upper head is probably easier to see. There's the jaws, and there's the teeth at the top, teeth at the bottom. You can see like a figure coming out from inside his mouth. You can see another tooth right there, by the way. So you have a two-headed twisting serpent, and it almost looks a little bit in twisting like smoke. So remember we talked about setting fire and that smoke would go into the heavens. Well, you know, in her vision, seeing the smoke, she sees it turning into a serpent with two heads. Now, why two heads? Well, remember a long time ago I mentioned when you hallucinate, you often see in multiples. So if you're seeing in multiples, you might see multiple heads. But with serpents, think about it. When they shed their old skin, you see their like shell of their old head, right? And then you see their brand new head coming out. So they are in effect having these two heads simultaneously. They molt their skin. It's also another symbol for regeneration. So this whole story and this whole prophecy that we're seeing, this vision that she's having, is in reference to this regeneration of their culture and something wonderful coming from this vision, like a prophecy of something good. This took place the same day as Shield Jaguar is being crowned as their king. So it's like a prophecy of his reign as King Shield Jaguar. A person's coming out here. He's holding a shield and he's holding a weapon. You can see his spear there. His shield's right on the other side. He's got jewelry. He's got the whole regalia. There's possibly a mask that he wears above his head that he could slide. Some people say that that's the mask. I haven't really gotten a good story on that. Shak, they believe him to possibly be Shak, the rain god. Now, wouldn't that be great if you have a vision and Shak, the rain god, shows himself to you? Well, that's perfect because, yeah, that's what we need. If Shield Jaguar's rain is going to bring us rain, then that's great. So that's a wonderful prophecy. So that's why this figure is in the center of all of our other lentils, and why this is a significant piece is because that is significant to their livelihood here. Now, one thing that I think is really interesting, remember I told you they read from left to right and top to bottom, right? Look at this. Why does it go the top to bottom to left instead of that? You know, like it looks like it's going this way. Well, for a long time, we couldn't figure it out. We couldn't understand why it was written this way. It doesn't make sense to us. Well, what they realized is, it had taken a while. Somebody had, like, I think, put a mirror to it or something and realized that everything was written in reverse. Why? Why was everything written like it's reversed in a mirror? Because she's in the middle of a vision. She's in another world. This is her on the other side trying to communicate to us. So that's why this whole thing was actually written in reverse. So it was a way for the artist to communicate that she's in another realm and in another world. And it took us forever to pick that up. Now the last lintel, the lintel 26, is Lady Shock and King Shield Jaguar. And he looks like he's dressed for war. He's got a dagger in his arm, or his hand. All of this, by the way, is all eroded. But she holds his helmet for war in her hands. And so that's, again, building an association between the two. I'm going to go back real quick so you can see how it's eroded. Yeah, so it's building that relationship. Okay, well, I'm going to stop here, and then we'll start with the Aztecs in the next video.